All right, so like a housekeeping issue real quick about last week, since you guys were scared of the hurricane and we didn't meet. So I'm just going to keep moving forward in the schedule the way we had it, and then I will squeeze the last topic into everything else as we go. So
you're saying this is the second one then?
This is the second one. Yep. Yeah, I'm not going to skip any. I don't need to skip anything. I think we can still stay on sort of same, at least cover the same material. All right, so as usual, start with a question. All right, so I have 3 questions for you guys throughout today, okay, that I want to sort of discuss first, and then kind of talk about it. So just just about love and responsibility, just in general, okay. So you'll see when we talk about things how theology of the body will sort of fill in some of the gaps in love and responsibility, and vice versa. They're sort of meant to go together, and it gives you a certain language. But what makes love and responsibility really good, first, that it actually assumes that men and women are different, which is, for whatever reason, not a big assumption these days. But it also, it's really, it's extremely dense to read, and really difficult to read. And Colleen had a book. You hold that book up that you had? Or whoever, I don't know who had it, but hold that.
I have it at the moment.
Yeah. Whoever had that book, hold that book up real quick. All right, so that book is more or less the practical parts of love and responsibility. And if you're looking for things to do in a small group or something like that, that book is awesome. It has questions and everything. The book itself, Love and Responsibility, John Paul II was a philosopher first and foremost, and it's thick and dense, and I read it this week, getting ready for this. This is probably the 5th or 6th time I read it, and I still sort of get stuff out of it. I'm like, wow, I didn't really catch that before. So it's really, it takes a little bit, it takes a lot of work to get through it. But the cool thing about it is it's not totally abstract. In fact, it's not at all abstract. If you can sort of understand the language, which hopefully after today you will, it's really, really practical. And it really sort of helps you understand yourself, but also helps you to understand your relationships, especially with people of the opposite sex. So that's why it's sort of the question-driven approach today of why we're going to start with this question right here. Right, is it ever okay to use another person? Why or why not? What do you think? Just shout it out.
Never.
Never okay to use another person. Why?
It also depends what you mean by.
So Kevin's been here enough that he just dinged me and said you didn't define your term.
No, with an asterisk.
Right. So we have to define what we mean by use, which we're going to talk about. But what about I don't know, if you're at work and your boss tells you to do something and it needs to be done and he needs it done, is he using you
No.
to get it done?
Yeah.
No. So most of you say no.
It is also true. It does sometimes depend.
Yeah.
Well, yes, he's using you to do work. You're a tool to make something happen, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
But you signed up for it.
Oh, so consent has something to do with it. So wait. So first of all, I heard that it's okay to be a tool, which I don't agree with at all. But then, secondly, I heard that as long as you consent to it, it's fine. That could be a little bit of a slippery slope, right? That's a funny word. Maybe I'm using you to get my point across.
Devil's advocate. Answer on today.
Yeah. Well, what is the? Where's the line? Is it just consent? Is it I'm okay with it if you're okay with it, or is there something else to it? Okay. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I really want us to begin to think about things we sort of think we understand and grasp that are just so basic that we actually don't grasp them because we haven't thought about them. And I include myself in this group because when I ask this question, I'm like, and we'll see why. To use someone, we're going to have to define it, but why the answer to that question is no. What were you guys thinking?
I was thinking in terms of the person giving you work to do. That's work is, it's a good thing, and they're paying you, and there's justice there. And
Well, hopefully when someone is using you or asking you to do something, I want to use the word use right now, it's a good thing. Like, hopefully you're not going, well, I just need some punishment. Like, so yeah, I agree. Like, you wouldn't do it if there wasn't some good involved in it, like, even if it's just your paycheck, right? So I agree. Okay. All right. So that's sort of what I want to, where I want to sort of take off is from just that question, and then we'll talk about use, what's use, what is not, and why it even matters. Okay. So what I did was all throughout this, I have, if you ever get a copy of the book, I have given page numbers of just what I think are sort of salient points that you could just really just skip from point to point to point instead of reading all the stuff in between, because we spend a lot of time kind of proving it and dissecting it and repeating. If you guys understand, this is actually a good thing for us to talk about. The way John Paul II teaches, most people teach in a linear fashion, right? They say, okay, if you understand A, let's move to B, let's move to C. But what he does is he says A, B, C, and he goes in a spiral, and he goes back to A and goes deeper. And he goes back to B a little deeper and a little. So you'll see as you read him, he tends to teach like that, where he goes very, very deeply on something that you hadn't really thought about, and that's why it's pretty profound. All right, so let's sort of frame the issue here, right? When we're talking about using something, right? So we come into contact with things all over the place, right? We come into thousands of objects every day that we use. Okay, be it the microphone that we're using to record, the computer, this room, the chair, all those things, right? Like, how many things do we say, okay, I'm going to use that as a means to an end. I'm going to use that as a means to an end. Okay? And there's literally thousands of those a day. So what John Paul II wants us to start thinking about is what happens when the object you're using is also a subject. Okay? So in other words, when you begin to think about the fact that what makes a person is that they can sort of self-determine, right? They can decide whether they're going to be a willing participant in being a means to an end. Okay, so this microphone, this recorder had no choice, right? But if Missy's going to write down the times, she has a choice, right? And so if I use Missy to write down the times, well, I have to be careful of how I do that, right? Like, I can't just boss her around, or I can't just assume she's going to do that, to communicate with her, all those things, right? So he wants us to first understand that what we're sort of using when we are working with or working for or doing something with is not just another object in the world, but a subject. Okay, and he wants us to say, okay, that's not just something, that's somebody. All right, so we immediately start with sort of just understanding the dignity of the human person, okay? And so the other person can now determine what kind of object they're going to be, whether they're going to be a tool or not, right? Okay, so, and here's what he says. This is exactly what I just said. Man's nature, and what I want to do is sort of, again, like we normally do, I'll give you a quote that's sort of dense, and then we'll put it in language that's a little bit more understandable, so you can learn how to read it. So man's nature differs fundamentally from that of the animals. It includes the power of self-determination based on reflection and manifested in the fact that man acts from a choice. Okay, which is what I just said about you can't determine what someone else is going to be. Only the individual person can determine what they will be and what they become and what they will do. All right? Not like your car. Your car has no choice to determine. It's not self-determined. All right? All right, so now let's... and he says something, too, that's actually pretty profound. He says, not even God can use us. All right? Not even God can use us. Because...
Free will.
Because of free will, right? Because he made us that way. He made it so that we couldn't be used even by him. Right? So when he gives us the power to determine what we will be and what we will become, he doesn't just say, okay, I'm the exception. I'm the asterisk. The divine asterisk. Okay? All right. So now let's define our term. So a person must not merely... Okay, now we're starting to get towards the question of work, whether your boss can use you. A person must not be merely the means to an end for another person. All right, and then the other thing too is if you read John Paul II, he loves like special fonts in his writing. Okay, I didn't do that. I didn't italicize. Merely, he did. In fact, sometimes it's like he italicizes so much that you're like, oh, I think the important thing is the part that's not italicized because he has so much of it. Okay, so what he's saying is that we can essentially have two different definitions for the word use. Okay, the first one that we've already talked about, to use something as a means to an end, right? And this, I'm not going to sort of belabor that point. But what actually constitutes? Well, so let's go back to my question about your boss using you or one of your professors using you. When two different people consciously choose a common aim, this puts them on a footing of equality. Man's capacity for love depends on his willingness consciously to seek a good together with others and to subordinate himself to that good for the sake of others or to others for the sake of that good. Okay, so what unites two people?
Like a greater cause.
Or an end, right? We'll use his language, right? Yes, a cause, a greater cause. So something that we call the common good between two people is what actually unites us, right? So when two people are working together on something, there's always a third thing there, all right? And there's always and they're always aiming at that third thing. And if the thing is really a good thing, then it's not something that can necessarily be divided up into pieces, okay? So there's a true unity when the thing they're working towards is a good that they both share in, okay? And they both share in equally because the good itself can't be divided up. Okay, so a lot of you eyes just totally glazed over when I said that. So let's think about a relationship between a man and a woman. All right, they come together. This is just any man and woman, not necessarily marriage. There's a third thing present when they begin to like each other and begin to see each other more. What's the third thing present? What's the thing they're together for? Ideally, what should the thing be? What's the thing that unites the Father and the Son? Love, right? So the common good of love. So when a man and a woman come together in marriage, it's not as if like the husband gets 74% of the love, the wife gets 26%, right? They're both at the service of that love. Okay, and this is really important because we're going to talk about, especially next week, we're going to talk about how we, not just man and woman together, although that's what theology is about, image the Trinity for that reason. Because there's always a third thing which the two coming together always aim at. Okay, and they share in it together. Right? And when they don't, this is what the whole book is about. He's like, when they don't, there's a problem. When one person, it's not even a matter of like sort of benefiting, but when the good they're aiming at is sort of divvied up, then it's not love any longer, it's use, right? So in a certain sense, going back to my question about, yes, you have the common aim that your boss has, the good of the company, but that can also, because of the way it can be not necessarily divvied up as if in a sort of an equal fashion where it can be divided up, he can actually use you, right? He can actually use you, all right? And so so I want us to sort of understand what actually makes a couple, we'll sort of take it back to the level of man and woman, what makes them one thing, ideally, is their love. Okay, so they're both at the service of their love. All right, so what he wants us to sort of look at then is just what the sort of prevailing culture is, so that we can have a sort of understanding of what we're fighting against. And he says, just very honestly, he's like, okay, there's lots of relationships in the world, and yeah, we work our contacts and we do this, but one of the main ways in which people use other people is sexual relationships. Okay? And I know I don't have to tell you that. I mean, I think that is probably, all of us have probably lived it in some fashion, more or less. But so he says the sexual relationship presents more opportunities than most other activities for treating a person, sometimes even without realizing it, as an object of use. All right, and this is why I sort of ding Colleen for what she said about this mutual consent. Okay, because there's this sort of ethic, this utilitarian ethic, in which where we say, okay, well that's fine. We're just trying to maximize pleasure, and the better the thing, the more people that can share in the pleasure, wonderful. Like that's the way to go. And so it's always governed by the pleasure principle, which, by the way, this is not just how we operate in relationships. This is the wider sort of cultural milieu in which we're in, where pleasure maximized, pain minimized. Pleasure for the most people, with pain for the least amount of people. Okay, and you can sort of begin to see where he's going with this and why he's saying this. All right. So, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with that mentality? Why is that wrong? I mean, I think you also intuitively go, yeah, well, that pleasure principle, utilitarianism, sounds wrong, but why? Go ahead.
Not respecting the other person.
Okay, but what if they consent? What if they're like, that's fine, I'm good with that?
You're still not treating them how they're supposed to be treated.
Yeah, so first of all, exactly. So part of it is whether if a person wants to act like an animal with you, that doesn't mean you should still treat them like an animal, right? So that's part of it. But why else?
The third thing's not there.
The third thing is not there, right? So what's the problem with, what's the third thing that they're sort of aiming at? Because they're supposed to be aiming at love, but what are they aiming at now? Pleasure. And what's the problem with pleasure? Well, it ends up being selfish, yes, but it's fleeting is the more important thing, right? Remember I said it has to be something that is static, that, yeah, it can grow, but at a certain point, pleasure, I can't in advance know how much pleasure something's going to give me, right? In fact, you can see how God has designed us like this, right? Where we have this sort of diminishment of pleasure as we keep doing the same things over and over until our mind, until we reasonably choose to do that thing, and then pleasure comes alive. But the point is that we can't perform a calculus. First of all, there's no calculus to go, I'm going to get 75 units of pleasure out of this. Okay, well, what if I get a stomachache right before it happens? Then I only get 27 units of it. What? I've been gypped. Like, do you owe me now? What's the deal? And you clearly enjoyed it more than I did. And you can see now how I look at another person and go, your job is to give me pleasure. Okay? And I'll try to give you some too. And if we're mutually beneficial to each other, then great. All right? If we're friends with benefits, awesome. That's great. Okay? So that's why it doesn't work. Okay? Because everyone, guess what? Everyone ends up unhappy in the end. All right? Because pleasure is fleeting. The person begins to bore you. All those things. You're anxious because, well, what if they stop liking me? What if? And you just have to keep upping the ante. Okay. So that's what he wants us to sort of do, is to replace this utilitarian ethic with an ethic of love. All right. And here's more or less what I just said. Utilitarianism puts the emphasis on the usefulness of any and every human activity. The useful is whatever gives pleasure and excludes its opposite. For pleasure is the essential ingredient of human happiness. All right? And he's saying that sort of tongue-in-cheek. He's not actually saying it. But he's saying that someone who subscribes to that actually believes that, right? And so what then happens if that is my sort of attitude in life, like grab as much pleasure as I can?
Like, you're only looking for yourself.
Yeah, and I'll use anyone and anything to get that. Okay? Especially if everyone else is doing it with me. So if it's just a rat race to maximize pleasure, everyone else will be using everyone else. And until somebody stops the madness, it just keeps going. All right? And so where he takes this from that first question is he gives what's called the personalistic norm. And here he gives it in two ways, okay? He says the personalistic norm, this norm in its negative aspect states that the person is the kind of good which does not admit of use and cannot be treated as an object of use, and as such the means to an end. And then he flips it and he says in the positive form, the personalistic norm confirms this. The person is a good toward which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. All right. So what do we mean when we say when we say love? Just in general. You guys remember this is very go again. What's this very simple definition of love? Willing the good of another person, right? That even if so let me just stop for a second, make sure we're clear on this. There is nothing wrong inherently with pleasure. It's a good thing. Things should be pleasurable. Right? I don't want us to sort of get in this sort of maybe a hidden Gnosticism or even just this puritanical spirit where, well, it's pleasurable, I can't do it. Like, I'm Catholic, I should just be miserable. That is not it at all, right? What he's trying to do, he's trying to show you, is he's trying to move us to the point where we actually feel more pleasure. Because it's a true, like, God has attached pleasure to things that are truly good, right? And when we use them in the manner that he gave them to us, that actually is more pleasurable than when we don't. That's the part we often always forget. Well, yeah, that actually kind of makes sense. Like when I use the car the right way, it actually gets me to my destination. So pleasure is a good thing. God has attached it to a thing. But if we treat it like a God itself, rather than the good that he's attached it to, then it goes away. Okay, eventually. And then we're trapped and we're just kind of flitting from pleasure to pleasure. All right, so at no point today do I want anyone to walk away from here going, well, it's a life of repression, and this is going to be terrible, but it'll be over soon, and man, heaven will be pretty good. So I want to have a body there, and there'll be no pleasure. No, that's not it at all, right? This is meant to free us so that we can actually feel and experience pleasure in the way that God made us to feel and experience pleasure. All right? Okay. All right. Let me just make sure my slides didn't get out of order here. Okay. All right. So, by the way, anyone who would ever accuse John Paul II of being like this celibate priest that's a prude never has read this book. By the way, he is. He gets it. And he gets it because he spent so much time in the confessional listening to people. But anyway, so he talks about what he calls the sexual urge. That is this attraction that we have to the opposite sex. And he said, remember we talked about it last time we met, we talked about those natural inclinations we have are sort of signs that we were made for something and made to do certain activities, right? And it's like one of the natural inclinations we have is towards marriage and raising the children. That's what he's sort of articulating here. But he's coming at it from underneath instead of from on top. So he says, sexual attraction makes obvious the fact that the attributes of the two sexes are complementary, so that a man and a woman can complete each other. Okay, so at first you're like, it's kind of very Jerry Maguire-ish. Like, what do you mean, complete each other?
You complete me.
Yeah. What he means by that, though, is that he's looking at it very much in if you guys remember, he used the term teleological, where it says, okay, things have an end to them, they have a purpose to them. What he's saying is, well, if you have a natural desire for this thing, well, that thing must be good for you. And because you have a natural desire for it and it's good for you, it must in some way complete you, who you are, and who you're meant to be. All right, that's all he's saying there. So he's saying the fact that we naturally have this desire for a person of the opposite sex is because we need that person. All right? And that's, which we'll talk much more about in theology of the body, but that's the idea of complementarity. Yes?
With the statement, we have these natural inclinations and that suggests it's a good, how does that work with homosexuality?
Yeah, so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much today, but we would say that that's disordered in some way. And I mean, we can talk more about it when there's a section of theology about it when we talk about it. But we would just say, he even says in the book, he said, yeah, there's some disordered attractions between men and men. But ultimately, it's no different than the disordered attraction I have to lie, or maybe Keegan to lie about the chairs. No, it's no different. It's no different than the disordered attraction I have to losing my patience, or something like we're just broken, right? And he talks about how to redeem. There is a section in the book about how to redeem the sexual urge too, which we can certainly talk about another time. Okay, so All right, so we naturally sort of experience what he calls the sexual urge. So it's this natural sort of attraction to another person. And he says, there's this tendency to seek out the opposite sex. We see someone and we're attracted to them. And it's almost like the experience, what he wants us to think about, he's very experiential. He wants us to think, that almost feels like something that happened to me, right? Not so much something that I did. And so he wants to be able to sort of, okay, we all experience this, right? I mean, I experience it. I'm a married man. I see someone of the opposite sex, and they're attractive. Like, what do you do with that, right? Like, everyone experiences that, all right? And so what he's trying to do is then go, okay, what's the next step in the process? Since this is stamped into us, and it's not just like turned off when you get married or you're in a relationship with someone, it's still there. So what do you have to do with it? And he says, first thing you have to do is draw it under the personalistic norm. So in other words, at every point when you experience this, the question is, you're sort of, it's something that's happening to you. At a certain point, you're cognizant that it's happening to you. What are you going to do with it? Okay, and are you going to go, this brings me pleasure, I'm going to keep doing it, or, oh, no, I can't use that person just for this pleasure. Okay? And that's very just sort of bare bones of what he's saying, and we're going to unpack that much more. So he's just saying, okay, the sexual urge can transcend the determinism of the natural order by an act of love, and its manifestation must be evaluated on the plane of love. That's very clear, right? That's not clear. Like, seriously, guys are like, no. No, essentially he's just saying what I just said about you have to decide what you're going to do now that you've experienced this thing. Forming a link in the chain of responsibility for love. All this is possible because psychologically the sexual urge does not fully determine human behavior but leaves room for exercise of the free will. So he's essentially saying we're not like animals, like, okay, I'm itchy, now I've got to find something to scratch it. Okay, everything we do requires the choice of the will. And he wants to make sure we understand that, okay? That it's just not this instinct, right? And it was actually given to us far differently than God gave animals instinct because he gave it to us so that we could have love. Okay, so he's saying the sexual urge, far from being dirty, far from being something that we just tolerate, is actually the seeds of love. Okay? All right, so now here becomes the question. What makes a person of the opposite sex attractive? And I don't want to hear, like, specifics, like, 6'2". Like, why could you look at two different people of the opposite sex, be attracted to one and not the other? Could you articulate it? Could you go, yeah, I like him because, or I like her because...
Like a little bit is like reproduction, like someone who might be a good potential parent to your children.
Okay, but let's just say it's just a flash like that. Someone walking by in the brickyard, and you see someone. What makes your heart go, whoa? And don't act like none of you have experienced that. Like, I feel pretty confident in saying that. What makes your heart go, whoa, just seeing someone?
Do you want us to say, I don't know?
Well, I mean, have you thought about it? Have you gone, I mean, does it surprise you sometimes?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I don't know. I think it operates.
You're treading on dangerous ground, by the way. You are the wrong person. Go ahead, though.
Well, I mean,
We're safe.
I'm just watching Nicole's hand to make sure she doesn't come up and hit you in the face.
I think like definitely physical attributes of the person of the opposite sex make a difference, but I think it's kind of deeper than that too. It's like, you kind of, I mean, if someone's just walking by, that's hard to say, but I guess like as you get to know someone more, it becomes more and more about, you're sort of intrigued. It's like you want to go deeper, you want to know about that person. It's really their soul, like who they are, that's sort of pulling you in.
All right, so I couldn't have answered that any better because what you did is just went where we are, where my question is, and where we want to get to. All right, you just made the whole trip there perfectly, and he wants us to understand how we get from A to B. Okay, how we and understand it, and understand our own psychology and why it happens. Okay, so he's going to talk about what it is exactly that makes, well, not specifically, but exactly what makes someone attracted to someone else, okay? So we have what he calls sexual values, okay? So when we decide something is good for us, right, regardless of, if we attach a value to it, okay? We say that is a good, that is a bad, okay? And we don't really respond to the object itself interiorly. We respond to the value we've attached to it, right? Like a bear could come running through that door, and I might just be really stupid and not know bears are dangerous, and I'd go, oh, it's really cute. And so I've attached a value to it, and I run up to it, and you guys are all running away like I knew he was dumb. But it's so I'm excited about seeing the bear, and you guys are all like literally trying to find out who the slowest person in the room is, so that you make sure you're faster than them, right? So that's the idea. So you're really responding to the value, right? And the same thing, like if the bear couldn't get the door open, none of us would really be scared of the bear right on the other side of the door.
I would still be pretty scared.
Okay, that's
Can't
fine.
leave you, just lock us in.
Yeah. But anyway, the point is that our response to things, especially our emotional and psychological responses, are always to the value we attach to the thing, not necessarily to the object itself. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So in other words, the first step in this process is when we see someone that makes our heart go, whoa, we've attached a value to it. Okay? And what he wants to know is what stimulates that value. All right? And he says that there's a physical one, and there's a psychological one, okay? So the physical one is what he calls sensuality. And here's what he says. When awareness of a person of the other sex only stirs sensuality, a body is commonly experienced as a potential object of enjoyment. Sensuality in and of itself has a consumer orientation. It is directed primarily and immediately towards a body. It touches the person only indirectly and tends to avoid direct contact. Okay, so you can see now. Yes, go ahead.
Is that like lust?
Hold your question for like 3 more slides, and we're actually going to decide when this is lust and when it's not. Okay. Okay, so what he's describing though is, okay, so somebody walks by you, and you find them physically attractive. Okay, and you've said that person, and it's because of what he calls their sexual value. Okay, so you've looked at them and they're a person of the opposite sex, and you're like, that would be a good. That would be a good for me. Okay, and again, that's the thing, that's sort of the experience we have, where we have to now decide what we're going to do with that. All right, so he calls that first part sensuality. Sensuality by itself is not love and may very easily become its opposite. At the same time, we must recognize that when a man and a woman come together, sensuality, as a natural reaction to a person of the other sex, is a sort of raw material for true conjugal love. All right, so he's asking the question, okay, now that I've found this person to be physically attractive, what am I supposed to do with it? All right, and he says that in a certain respect, it's not to deny it, first of all. Okay? Unless you can't do anything about it. Right, so in other words, it comes back under reason, right? But say it's sort of, he's talking about from a foundational experience, and this person of the opposites, and now if you go, wow, I would really like to take her home. Okay, what have you decided? That you're going to use her, right? Because of the value you've attached to her physically. Okay, and I deliberately said him to her because this is the temptation for guys. Okay, and John Paul II says this. He says, okay, men tend to be much more sensual. Okay, they respond much more quickly to the physical sexual attributes of a woman. Okay, that's written into us, and there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about after we talk about sentimentality. But so at every point, there is always the question of, am I going to use this person for pleasure, or am I going to actually remember that those sexual values are actually attached to a person of which the only adequate response is love. All right? And that doesn't mean you go fall in love with them, right? But love is to will the good of another, which means don't treat them like an object. So besides being really creepy and weird, like staring at a woman that's really beautiful is using her as an object, right? It's because you're getting pleasure from the way that she looks, all right? Regardless of, and that's why we say not to do that. We say custody of the eyes, not because, again, we're prudes, but because we don't want to treat anyone like an object, all right? Where we just use them for our own pleasure, right? So it's not just, I want to take her home. I might just like to just stare at her, okay? And this is also why pornography is a much bigger temptation for guys than it is for women. Because guys respond to the physical, sexual value of a woman, okay? And which is why the flip of this, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, it's also why men tend not to have problems with modesty, like as far as how they dress and how they look. Women do. And we'll talk about why modesty is important in a second. All right. So, ladies, you are not off the hook. Because a woman is more attracted to the psychological value of a man. Okay? And what does he mean by that? So, a woman, or a man can do this too, it just tends to be, a woman will look at a man and look at him in a psychological way, as in whether he's masculine or not. Okay? And this has to do with their psychological makeup, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Not nearly as concerned about the physical attributes of them, insofar as they still reveal what they think that kind of person is. Is it the kind of person that will take care of me? Remember, women are naturally sort of receptive, and again, not to risk being stoned, but they are the fairer sex for a reason, because they're meant to be protected and honored by men, and it's written in their DNA, no matter how much feminists try to deny it. And so what they are looking for is men who will protect them, right? So that sounds fine, right? It sounds like women are totally off the hook and they're good, and except you can use someone that way, okay? And there's two ways, and it's actually more dangerous, I think, and a little more hidden. The first is same thing, that guy makes me feel safe. I'm just, I'm going to use him to hang out with him because he makes me feel safe. But the other is, and this is probably more common, is, remember, this is almost a flash where you go, I perceive this value in them. I perceive that they're masculine. They're going to protect me. And then you find out that they really don't have that value. Okay, when you get to know them a little bit, but they still make you feel that way. And so you're sort of using them, right? You're using them to feel protected. And so what John Paul II kind of warns about is this habit of idealizing someone. All right, and again, he puts words to something we've all experienced. You look at your friend and you're like, why is she with him? Doesn't she see what he's like? Yeah, because she's idealized him. She's made it so that she feels like he has these things, right? And this is why guys hate chick flicks and women love them. Right? Think about it. That's the story of the chick flick, right? It's this guy that she meets that's a total creep, and then she somehow sort of makes him better, and it's because she's idealized him, right? Or she's given him these masculine characteristics, and he doesn't really have them, and he lets her down, and then he still doesn't have them at the end of the movie, but at least she feels like he does now. Okay, and that's why women like those stories, because it's stamped into them, and why guys think they're absurd. It's dude, he's a jackass. What are you doing? It's so obvious. That's why. Okay, and that's why they're marketed as chick flicks and not, I don't know what dude flicks would be, but something else. So anyway, the point is that the use is going in different directions. And you could see how people could be mutually beneficial from a use standpoint to each other, right? You could see the danger of that. But again, not to put it all negative, and we'll talk more about this towards the end, understanding this is also a positive. Knowing that your girlfriend or your fiance or your wife-to-be tends to be more sentimental when you want to make a gift of yourself to the person, You don't expect her to be physically responsive. You expect to be emotionally responsible for her, because that's what she needs, and vice versa. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But the point is that part about being attractive. The sort of initial attraction should make you go, to Kevin's point, that is a person I would like to get to know. Okay? Because that sexual value is still there, and it should still be there 6 months from now, a year from now, hopefully. And if you discover that it was attached to something that wasn't, well, hopefully you've moved on to someone else. Right? And it doesn't mean that the person was a bad person, but you realize you discovered that sexual value wasn't really there. Okay? So your initial response was wrong, and that's okay. All right? But it's still understanding that it's an invitation to love. All right? Does that make sense? Again, I don't want us to walk out of here going, well, when I encounter these people, I have to just turn it off. That's not it at all. It should lead you to a discovery of the person. Okay? All right. And we're going to come back to those two things in a minute, but that's important. Okay. So, where this is sort of all leading to, okay? He talks about what makes mature love. He says responsibility, that's the name, love and responsibility. For love clearly comes down to responsibility for the person, originates in it, and returns to it. The greater the feeling of responsibility for the person, the more true love there is. So he's trying to help us sort of understand what true love actually consists in. And it's a willingness to take responsibility for the other person. All right? Personally, I wish I had read this before, like, my pre-Cana, so I didn't embarrass myself. But I can remember the priest asking me in the little meeting that he had with each of the people, like my wife and I separately. And he said, so why do you want to marry Allison? And I start listing like attributes, right, of why I like her so much. And he stops me after like my fifth one. I'm starting to get a little creative, right? Like I'm like, I got a whole bunch of these things. Like I don't even know if these are true, but they sound good, right? Because I mean, honestly, like this is one of the things he talks about. If you really ask why you love someone, the answer is I don't know. Like that's the right answer, right? Because all those things I was listing about her could go away, right? And then I haven't loved the person. I've loved the way she makes me feel. I've loved the things about her that could very well change, right? And I don't want to be loved like that either, right? Like, you know, suppose I end up in a wheelchair, right? And she loved me because I was really fast.
Really fast.
Yeah. I mean, that's not good, right? But he said to me, he started shaking his head after like number 5. He's like, and it was almost like, you pitiful, pitiful man. And he said, nope. He said, that's not good. I was like, Father, why isn't that good? He said, well, he's like, I want you to go back out there and I want you to look at her and decide if you can make a gift of yourself to her for the rest of your life. And then you come back to me and I'll ask you why you want to marry her. And he's like, if the answer to that question is no, he's like, that's not the girl for you. He's like, because you get one shot at making a complete and total gift of yourself to another person. And if that's not the person you marry with, then she's not the one for you. And that's okay. That's why you're here. But I really appreciated his honesty, even though I was mortified. But nevertheless, that was his point. Like he's like, are you ready to take responsibility for this person? Because all those things you thought were love, that's not love. You like those things, that's cool, and they attracted you. But now you're yoked, or you're going to be yoked to a person who is a mystery deep, deep down, right? And we can never get to know completely. All right? So that's what he wants to move us towards, is having this mature sense of responsibility for the other person.
Can you contrast that with, you hear people say, like, that's interesting.
Yeah, slides kind of ran together here. Let me back out of this and find out why they ran together. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Like, there's an unhealthy way to take responsibility for someone too, right? Where like someone's making a mistake and you try to cover it up for them or stuff like that. Just like, how would he define responsibility for a person?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, he's tying it into. Hold on one second, John. Let me make sure.
Yeah.
It looks like maybe I copied a slide, intro slide, which I've never done before.
Pretty good.
Okay, so your question about like, so you're really talking about when does it become enabling, right? More than anything else, and obviously that is a kind of a kind of personal like discernment issue. Like when do you? Because marriage is meant to heal people too, right? I think it comes down to when you get to the point of when it's actually a good for the person. Like a good for the person is not necessarily to do everything for them, right? A good for the person sometimes is to let them suffer and dangle on their own. And I mean, I think it becomes there is a lot of just, and women tend to do this more than men, where women go after guys they think they can fix, right? And it really becomes this relationship in which she's using him for her feeling to be needed, okay? And it's just as unhealthy. So I think if you're in those situations, you kind of got to look at it and go, why am I doing this? Like, is this really helping? But that becomes you see this a lot with couples, especially when somebody gets sick. One of them gets sick, and they get used to taking care of the other person, and they're not sick anymore. And then they're like, what do I do now? Like, I kind of liked the idea of them being dependent upon me because, but it's always, always, always better to be loved than to be needed. Okay, that we have to understand that, right? Because there can always be a time when you're not needed anymore. The love is just for who you are as a person. All right, so John Paul II gives us sort of this way to discern the difference between what he calls mature love and immature love. This is kind of summarizing the first 13 slides or 12 slides that we did. So he says an immature love is one based primarily on my feelings. Okay, and we sort of already know that, right? About how it makes me feel. Remember, he's saying it's based primarily on that. Okay, again, nothing wrong with you should. And it's a really cold love when the person actually they don't feel anything for you. No, I really like being around you. Really, seriously, like they're like dry about it. Really, because why do you have that look on your face? Because you don't look like you're having fun at all. Oh, this is great. I will the good for you. I really do. I will the good for you. That's not what he's saying again. Okay, but the primary aspect is that it is based on that third thing. Okay, that third thing present in every relationship. The emphasis on your feelings. The other is the emphasis on the good of the other person. Again, only the emphasis. Remember what I said earlier about there's this sort of hidden anxiety, insecurity that sort of comes up with, well, what if I don't do those things that she likes anymore? What if I'm not good at that? What if all those things, right? And there's always this anxiety, right? And you're always going, do you like me? It becomes like a little high school thing, like sending them notes during the day or texts asking if you still like me. Circle yes if you like me, that kind of thing. But when it is a mature love, it's peaceful, okay? Because everything, the emotions are in the right place, right? So I've attached those emotions, I've attached pleasure to a true good. Like I found out that the person is a true good, not in the sense of like all people are true good, but a true good for me. Okay, I've seen that all the value attached to that person was, spot on. Okay, and I realize now, and this is where the part where now emotionally I'm actually more available and I feel things more deeply. Okay, and then the last is sort of just kind of a summary on. My experience is based on my own sensual and emotional enjoyment. And then the mature love is self-giving. It's responsibility for the other person. Okay. All right, so that's yes, JT.
How do you get a person to care more about the good of the other person than their own subjective feelings?
I don't think you get a person to do that. I think that's part of it, right? So I think what you have to do is, that's what love is. Like, I don't have a formula to get there from like here to actually a person being willing to give their life for you. But what you have to decide is whether there is a person that you're willing to give your life for. That's really, like, there's a person out there, and you may not have met her yet, but am I the kind of guy who's ready to do that? Am I the kind of guy who can, and that's what John Paul II has given us, is this formula to go, okay, how do I become that kind of person? But so that when God puts that person in my life, I'm ready. I'm ready to make a full gift of myself to that person. So I don't know that you can necessarily get someone there, which I don't know if that's really what you were asking. Like love potion number 9. I think you were asking a different way. Like,
I think a lot of people, when they start out kind of immature, like what they're looking for in the other person.
oh, absolutely. That's the point, though. Like, so you're going to go because it's got to grow to maturity. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with the immature love on the left side. Like, but if that's all you got and that's as far as you go, then there's a problem. So in other words, I meet someone for the very first time, of course it's going to be based on my feelings. Like, primarily, like when I see that person and I go, whoa, I'm gonna go, yeah, that she made my heart skip a beat, so I want to talk to her, right? And that's okay. It's not a matter of, that's what I meant earlier about, don't see that necessarily as bad, but the problem is most people stop over there on that side instead of going, no, I wouldn't expect, I think it'd be actually kind of weird, a little freaky, like, you know, like the 5-minute dating and you sit down at the table with them and you're like, I'm ready to make a sincere gift of myself. How about you? So I don't want to give that impression.
If you do that too early, you end up being the other kind of person he was asking about too, where you do everything for them.
Yes.
And JT, maybe, I think I kind of know what you're getting at. It's like, just as your immature love needs to develop towards mature love when you're courting someone, it's like you need to an extent, trust that they will do the same. And that's part of the whole discernment thing is you two realizing, okay, we have matured to this point.
I think more what I was getting is that, like John Paul II is kind of writing to the modern world, and he's trying to tell them, the immature love is, it's not going to make you happy. You want the mature love in the long run.
Right.
But it seems like kind of a tough sell, like, emphasizing the good of another person at the expense of your own, pleasure. That's, a lot of people don't want to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, so remember that a gift goes two ways, right? A gift goes, they have to have the capacity to receive it, right? And if that person doesn't have the capacity to receive, someone as a gift, then they're just not ready, right? Like, that's just not, what you do with that, again, is like a personal thing, but a gift that's the part we forget, right? Like, and I will tell you, this is a great temptation in marriage, just in general. Like, you so emphasize, well, I got to make a gift of myself. I got to make a gift of myself, and you forget that also means receiving the gift of the other person, which means they have to have the capacity to receive you and to give themselves. So, I mean, I can understand what you're saying. I mean, this is a huge problem in you guys' generation, especially, but it started with mine, where the capacity to do this is almost completely lost mostly because of the presence of contraception, which we can talk more about. But just, I mean, that's a real issue. But I would say if you're in a relationship with someone and they're not capable of that, then that might not be the person for you. But also remembering that love causes good in other people, right? So when you love someone with a sort of in a sincere way, it elevates the person. Like, it has a power all its own, and it elevates the person. And again, that's not so you sit around and go, I'm just waiting. But I think the first step in the process is to go, can I be that kind of guy? And then when you know that you can be that kind of guy, or you think you have it in you, and you find someone that you think you can do that with specifically, then one of the tests is she capable of receiving and giving? And I think does that answer your question? Sort of.
Something else to keep in mind is, like, because you're saying, if I have to sacrifice myself for this other person, that's a tough sell. You're completely right, and that's why, especially among many reasons why there is such a high divorce rate, because so many people don't really understand what that commitment is in marriage.
I'd say on the flip side though as well, like we kind of have natural inclinations towards in that regard. Like we all desire love, and like yeah, we might be a little disordered and like think pleasure is the way to get there, but like it is fleeting. So like you keep chasing that, like you will be disappointed, and like that is maybe not effectively, but it's gonna point you towards like true love.
That is such an important. Like, I hope that got on that, because that is such an important point of just all of us have this desire to be loved, and that there's an emptiness. Like I said, like our generations were sort of caught up in this, but there is a collective emptiness as well, and because we were made for love, it's really hard to say. Like if you meet someone and you love them purely. It takes a cold person not to respond back, right? Like they really wants to manipulate and in kind. And again, that's not just keep hanging around, but I know I totally didn't completely answer your question, because I don't think there is. That's the sort of mysterious part of like Adam meeting Eve kind of thing. Like, how does that happen that two people are ready to do that? And I don't have necessarily a formula for that, I guess. Longest non-answer to a question ever. Okay. All right. So second question about what actually makes someone attractive to us, and here is the principle or law that he gives us. Love consists of a commitment which limits one's freedom. All right, this is so important, by the way. Like every yes that you say is a no. All right, we're going to talk about why this is really important when we talk about modesty and chastity. Every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to everything else attached to it, right? Which is the great sort of eye-opener for a lot of people that are so stuck on freedom that they don't realize that you actually have to make a decision, right? People get so addicted to freedom that they don't make any decisions, right? So love consists of a commitment which limits one's freedom. Limitation of one's freedom might seem to be something negative and unpleasant, but love makes it a positive, joyful, and creative thing. Freedom exists for the sake of love. And so we were given freedom in order to love. If freedom is not used, is not taken advantage of by love, it becomes a negative thing and gives human beings a feeling of emptiness and unfulfillment. Love commits freedom and imbues it with that to which the will is naturally attracted, goodness. Which is pretty much what we just said, right? All right, third question. Can you give me a positive definition of chastity? I'll take a negative definition to start, and then I will.
So I'm not sure what you mean by positive.
I will. Well, so you can define things negative. You say it's not this, or it's restraining myself. Like that's a negative definition. If you nail this, I'm going to be so upset at you, by the way.
I mean,
okay.
It's not. It's one of those definitions that would require you to define like 6 more words, right? But it's
Well, that's what we're going to do.
It's expressing your sexuality in the way it's meant to be expressed. Because it's not celibacy, it's not abstinence, it's using your sexuality the way it's supposed to be used. And that's why it gets confused with all those other things, because it depends on the state of life. But
does that satisfy you guys, that definition? It's okay. He's got pretty thick skin if someone doesn't like it.
I'm pretty good with it.
I'm still waiting on definitions, but yeah.
All right, let's start. All right. So what John Paul II talks about, he starts, there's a section of the book, and he talks about this resentment of chastity. Right? And what he means by that is when a virtue is hard, we have this sort of fallen innate tendency to sort of poo-poo it, right? Like you tell someone you're trying to be chaste, they laugh at you, right? And he's saying, well, that's the resentment of something that's just hard. Okay, and so when we're confronted with something that's hard, we have 2 choices, right? We could laugh it off and go, or we could actually attempt it, right? We could actually attempt it. And so what he's saying is, this value becomes an anti-value because eventually it becomes something that is like a sign of mockery, right? And so what he wants to do is move us so that we don't see chastity as an obstacle to love, but something inherently necessary to it. All right. So that's what he's getting at. So the sort of the prevailing attitude is that that it's something negative, that it's just like all restraint, just one long no. But what he wants us to see is that we can actually say it's a yes to something, okay? And we're going to talk about what that something is. So this mistaken view of chastity explains the common inference that it is purely a negative virtue. Chastity in this view is one long no, where it is above all the yes, of which certain no's are the consequence. All right. So going back to what he said about this idea of when you say yes to something, that you're also saying no to a lot of other things. So what is chastity saying yes to? Love.
But a particular kind.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly is the yes to love, right? But he says something even deeper. He says, only someone who's chaste actually knows how to love.
So does it something to do with like sacrificing yourself?
As a little, don't think of it, I mean, yes, but that sounds a little bit negative, right? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, we talk about love, like making a gift of yourself, sacrificing, but we have to be careful that it's also a really positive thing too, right? Like, so why is it only chaste men and women are capable of true love? I want us to sort of unpack this for a second.
You can only make a complete gift of yourself to one person. Like, so that's part of it.
Yep. There's an even more fundamental part. I'll use myself as an example why I didn't give this answer to the priest. To give yourself, what do you have to do of yourself? Own yourself, right? And if I don't own myself, guess what I can't do? Give myself, right? So if I'm in just a habit of just every little whim, the wind blows a certain way, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, is that self-ownership?
So it's like the command of your will?
The will is predominant. Like, reason says good, will says do it, body follows. Maybe begrudgingly at first, but that's the idea, right? So that's why he keeps saying, you know what? Somebody who gets blown by the wind, they're not free. They're on the beck and call of the wind. Right? So do we have to respond to every single impulse that comes in our body that we just said earlier that we really don't feel like that was something that actually I chose? It just sort of happened to me. Guess what that makes you? A slave, right? That's not freedom. Right? And so what he wants to really have us do is to own ourselves so that we can be free. And then the sign of that is love. Right? When I can freely go, yeah, I love that person, I'm attracted to that person, all those things, but I chose that. It didn't just fall upon me, I freely chose that. And I freely choose it over and over again because a total gift of myself includes time. Right? That's what he wants us to do. So chastity gives us the power to do that. Where suddenly every sort of time of arousal, I don't have to respond. Like, I can then go, wait, is this time, place, like all those things, right? I can begin to think about things in that way and not go, I'm itchy, I better scratch. Like, it's completely, that's freedom, okay? And that's so antithetical to the way we've been brought up and the way we think. But only the virtuous person is free. Because they're not under control of anything besides themselves. Right? And, that is the take-home message of what he's saying. That's why chastity is a good thing. Because John Claude is exactly right. It is using but it's not becoming enslaved to your passions. Right? You decide. All right? So only the chaste man and chaste woman are capable of true love, for chastity frees their association, including their marital intercourse, from that tendency to use a person. All right? So it's not using your spouse as a back scratcher, right? It's sitting there being itchy for a few minutes. Yes?
But that is rooted in what St. Paul wrote about, when it comes to, the desires of the flesh and going beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, so what he's trying to do is those sort of disordered desires where that response, and I feel like that's concupiscence, right, which is what he's talking about. But those feelings and desires are in themselves good because God gave them to us. But they're only good, and you only truly feel when you freely choose them, and they're in accord with when they should be. Okay, so yes, it's exactly like St. Paul's saying about not being a slave to the flesh. So he wants us to be free. Okay, so somebody asked earlier about when we can. I think we have enough sort of information to begin to think about this. How do we decide the difference between discerning someone's sexual value and lust? Okay, so in other words, person makes my heart skip a beat. Is that lust? So where's the line? Yes.
Like when it continues to only like be that immature thing, right? And you're like, it's only focusing on the self that like.
Okay, so completely and totally focusing on the pleasure without a desire to see the person underneath, right? And so chastity as a virtue enables us to see the other person as a person and not a means to my gratification. All right? And so he says, okay, the first step in that process is just the response, right? It's happening to me. And then with that comes this it's not even a temptation per se, it's just immediately our next response is that thing, which is a person, is an object of my pleasure. What do I do with it now? And I go, that object is a subject. But a subject I'd like to get to know, I think. But it has to always go to that object is a subject. Okay? It's when it doesn't go to a subject and it just goes to still an object. Still like looking at her. Still makes me feel safe. That's when you've now moved to lust. Okay? Okay, it doesn't have to be like we tend to think like lust is really pernicious, but that's what it is. Okay? And lust, it sort of handcuffs us from being chaste. All right? All right, so he ties in two other things with this, and then we'll be done, which are important. So he talks about, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about theology of the body, because he talks about Adam and Eve being naked and unashamed in theology of the body. This, he just talks about the experience of shame. Okay? Why we experience shame. And he says shame is a natural form of self-defense for the person against the danger of descending or being pushed into the position of an object for sexual use. Okay, what does he mean by that? Okay, so he says we experience shame when something interior to us is revealed that we didn't want to reveal. Just in a broad sense, right? Like think about, you did something nice for someone and they stand up in the room full of people and let everyone know what you did and you feel ashamed, right? Even though it was a good thing, because you never intended that thing, that interior thing, that act of charity to be known to everyone else. All right, and then he moves it from that to in sort of the sexual realm, why men and women, when they're seen naked, are ashamed. Okay? And we initially think, well, okay, is shame a good thing or a bad thing? Well, what do you guys say? Is shame a good thing or a bad thing?
Depends.
I would say neutral. It depends on context.
Okay, so it depends. Most people would say, this is probably only a room on campus that would say that. Most people would say, no, it's a bad thing. Right? But what he's actually saying is it's a good thing because it's built into us to protect us from becoming objects to other people. All right. Yes?
So it's kind of like, is guilt a bad thing? It's like, yes, it's good in the sense that it makes you aware that you're doing something wrong, but copious amounts of guilt are also bad.
Yeah. But this is even more positive than that, right? Like shame is a positive thing. It's saying that you're revealing something about yourself that you shouldn't reveal. All right? That was meant to remain private. Except, he doesn't just leave it there. He says, love actually swallows up shame. All right? So this is how Adam and Eve are naked without shame, is because Adam looks upon Eve as a person. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. He sees the person. She has no clothes on. It doesn't matter. Sees the person. Loves her for who she is. And she's not ashamed. He's not ashamed to be naked in front of her, right? When a husband and a wife, when the wife and the husband have they know they're not being used, they're unashamed in front of each other, right? Like a husband walks into the bathroom, his wife's taking a shower, she doesn't cover up the way she would if someone else did, right? Hopefully. Yes, Keith.
So, it sounds like shame only came after the fall.
Yes.
So then, would that be a result of sin and hence not good?
Well, no. Think about like God built in all kinds of protections for us too, right? So it's protective there'll be no shame in heaven, but it's protective in the sense of it protects us from because use as an object is a cause of the fall where we use other people. So yeah, I would say it's a good only in the sense that it helps us now. It's sort of like the sun is a good, and so is sunscreen, right? Like it's that kind of thing. Yes. Either one, I don't care.
Well, to kind of like maybe expand upon that is that like shame comes from like a person's misuse of you. So like, you know, it only exists after the fall because like a person misuses another person, right? You know,
Yeah.
so that's why it's like called a self-defense.
Yes.
So confession. You would need confession before the fall.
Yeah, it's more so the idea of like, it seems self-centered to me. Like, ideally, if we only had our eyes on another and like seeing God through them and all that, then we wouldn't be shameful of really anything being revealed. It's like, this might be a tangent that we don't need to go on, but when you said it, I thought about like, a lot of people feel shame going into confession, even though, like, obviously, the shame or guilt, whatever it is, for the sin is good in the sense that it leads us away from there. But we shouldn't be shameful because it's not bad to reveal the sin to the priest because it's like necessary.
Yeah, and some of that is a psychological thing too. Whereas you should be ashamed, no matter what, of coming in here and telling everyone your sins, right? So I think we have trouble detaching that. I don't think like if some of that is just a psychological and maybe a little bit of a lack of faith too, in that if Jesus was really sitting there, you wouldn't be ashamed. You're ashamed because it is another human person. Yeah, he's a priest, but it feels kind of weird. So I think it's more that than it is. I think it's still the protection of I shouldn't go around telling people my sins.
And are you guys saying like we shouldn't have to resort to shame? Like we should be comfortable enough as is?
I guess it is like in heaven there's not going to be shame. Mm-hmm. So like to me it seems like shame wouldn't be good, but in the sense that it is like there's a prudence attached to it is what I think is what you're trying to get across.
Yeah.
And so like that's
think of it this way, because like you're saying, like we only need shame because now sin is in the world, so people use knows it's not because it's now a possibility. Likewise, in heaven there would be no sin, that we wouldn't need shame. Yeah. Think of like basic pain in your body, like you touch a hot stove. Like pain is not good in itself, but it protects you. Is that?
Yeah. What were you going to say, Connor?
I think I was going to touch on this earlier. I think I'm wondering what the difference between, because at least when I thought about it, we think of, so going back to the garden, the fall, Adam and Eve hide, God comes looking, and then contrasting with David, who comes with his solemn life. The contrast between shame and contrition. I was wondering, is that, because I had looked at it as like, okay, shame is, there are two reactions to like, okay, something is wrong, but one brings you towards God, the other makes you hide yourself. Was that just an improper understanding of shame?
Well, but it's interesting, right? So what is their response when they're ashamed? They make something to cover themselves. Right? It's not just they hide. So I think there's two separate things going on. They hide because they've offended God. But now they've also made clothes for themselves. Like, how are those two things even, like, unless this part is true, why would they do that? Like, seems kind of foolish, right? Like, okay, they offended God. Why are they making fig leaves for themselves? Right? So I think it's both. So I think the point is I want us to walk away going, oh, shame is medicinal, like guilt, like Andrew said. That if I feel guilt, if I feel shame, that might be for a reason, and not to listen to my Freudian friend who says, "Oh, you shouldn't be ashamed about anything." And I think that's more of it. Then. Okay. And then there's different degrees too when we talk about sort of the psychological part of it. Like maybe what we use for shame. The word we use for shame is broader than the way he's using it, right? He really means it in the sort of the sexual realm more than anything else. Because he's trying to lead us towards another sort of a positive thing, which is the virtue of modesty. Okay? And how, in essence, shame or modesty or immodesty is ignoring shame. Okay? But why else, again, let's sort of think about this for a second. Why is modesty important? Modesty in the sense of how we dress more than anything else. Go ahead.
Oh. Well, I was going to say, like, it's a command of yourself, right? But it's not thinking about, like, how you dress type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
So, I mean, it gives, like, I'm having trouble answering this without being annoyed because people say, like, oh, it doesn't matter whatever, but it does matter, right? Because we're all fallen and we're all susceptible to seeing other people as objects. So modesty gives people that you meet a chance to see you easier without seeing you as an object. And,
so let's you're on the right track. So let's use the words that John Paul II used and see if we can pin this down so that we have the vocabulary. So modesty hides what?
Sexual value.
Sexual value, right? So modesty hides your sexual value. Why would you want to hide your sexual value?
So you'd be seen as a
Keep going.
subject.
Yes. Right? So modesty is essentially, it's like the anti-use virtue, right? Why do we make a bigger deal about women being modest versus men? Again, let's see how much you guys have digested, and let's use John Paul II's language. Why is it a bigger
men are
deal?
more drawn to the sexual value.
To the physical men are more drawn to the physical sexual value.
And women are drawn more to sentiment.
Yeah, which we're going to get to in a second, what men can do in response to that. Yes?
So then what is the difference between modesty and chastity?
So chastity modesty would probably be a sub-virtue of chastity because it's very specific about my appearance. Don't think of them necessarily as different, just think of modesty being specialized chastity related to my appearance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kevin, what were you going to say?
Oh, it's not anything. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So modesty, especially for women, hides their sexual value from the men, so as for both, right? So that the man isn't tempted to use her, and she does not become an object of use. Okay. So it again is a positive thing, right? And all because it clears the way for love. Right, to be loved really as you are. And again, that doesn't mean like every woman needs to walk around in a turtleneck and long pants. But the point is that intentionally, the culture says you have to dress this way to get guys' attention. But it's not the attention you want, right? Yes, you should wear clothing that's attractive and that does attract people. You shouldn't look like a slob or look gender neutral when you dress or anything like that. But the point is that at a certain point, especially culturally, it's really what you're really trying to do is incite a man to use you as an object. Okay. All right. Ladies and men not off the hook, though, on the other side of this. So he talks about tenderness. All right, so hopefully I'm not telling you ladies like inside baseball stuff, but guys will manipulate emotions because they know that's what you need. Okay? And so this is what, because the emotional women, in and of themselves, by nature, have a much, this is probably going to surprise everyone, a much richer and deeper emotional life than guys. Isn't that amazing? Like, that is the biggest insight of this entire book, right? No, because they have that makes them more susceptible to sentimentality, right? And so guys, in turn, have to be emotionally modest, okay? When you make an emotional investment in a woman, you are in some respects leading her on in the same way that a woman would lead you on based on how she's dressed. All right? You have to just be aware of that, right? Like, you're creating this attraction that you're not even necessarily aware of it. Like, if you asked a lot of ladies that dress not totally provocatively, they know what they're doing, but moderately provocative, they have no idea. Because women aren't wired like that. They're like, what? Seriously? And it's the same thing with a lot of guys. Like, if you think, well, I'm just hanging out in the friend zone, it's all good. But when you invest emotionally in a woman, that can send a very mixed message, because that appeals right to their sexual value. And so what he wants us to do is to move towards genuine, what he calls genuine tenderness. All right. And then vice versa, it can also lead to, there's sort of a mutual use there too. I mean, I can remember that, there were guys that I went to high school and college with that would hug every girl that came, like, they were friends with every girl and they'd hug them. Like, that's a little odd, right? Because they're getting this physical gratification and meeting the emotional needs of the woman. Right? Like, these acts of tenderness have their place, is what he's saying. And understanding that they mean something. That what we do physically means something, and it says something. And so what he wants us to do, and this now to sort of take it in a positive direction, this should also, I present it as a warning, but it should go the other way too. Understanding that actually when you really do like a guy or a girl, that, like, we've talked about love languages before, but this is deeper than that, right? This is understanding that not every time that, my girlfriend or boyfriend gives me a hug, should I get really, really excited. Like, and understanding that she has emotional needs that I need to take care of too, or even in marriage, understanding that. Then understanding there's a different way that men and women are wired, that men have to be more emotionally sensitive towards women, and women have to be more physically sensitive towards men. Right? And now you see the genius of complementarity. Right? That's the part about the completion of the other person. Right? What's your question?
Just kind of in how this relates to, like, with men being emotionally modest. I guess, how does that relate to male-female friendships?
I mean, it doesn't preclude friendships at all. I didn't mean to sort of imply that, but there's a line, I think, that I think only interiorly you can sort of know for yourself, where you are just saying, well, I'm using that person for the emotional stability or whatever they give me, even though we're just friends, right?
Example, if you're married and you can't talk to your husband about what's bothering you, you go talk to your guy friend about everything.
Yes, I think that's a great example. I mean, it's... I know this teenager, who I may or may not be related to, who got a girl's number. So he asked her out, and she's like, oh, no, I have a boyfriend. Like, this is after she gave him her number, talking to him for days, and in the midst of like the flurry of text, he goes, where did I see this wrong? And she's like, I just don't have anyone to talk to. And I said, that's use, man. Like, she should be first talking to her boyfriend, and if that's not working out, then maybe you just need to sit tight. But that's the idea, right? Where it's just like, I have a boyfriend, but I have no one to talk to. And I really hope he never hears this. Although I didn't say I was actually related to him. Never mind. Yes.
So, like, are you supposed to be, like, cold to, like in that situation? Like, are you supposed to be cold?
No, you just have to know where your boundaries are, right? Like,
Okay.
like as a married man, and I when I interact with women at work, I have to just know where the boundaries are. Like, yeah, that's you're asking me to carry some emotional baggage that I shouldn't be carrying for you.
Okay, so, like, do you tell them that? Like,
No, I mean, you can if you want to be blunt. I mean, that'll be the end of it. You just gracefully sort of cut off the conversation. You just sort of stop. Like, you just kind of gracefully cut off that part of the conversation.
Okay.
Or you remind them again, like, one of the tricks is, well, what did, your husband say about it?
I think another good example.
We're talking about
People.
Yeah, don't ever get in that. I'll just tell you that right now. Never get into, complaining about the husband or wife. And don't ever be one of those people either that complains. I mean, you complain to your friends, that's fine, but not guys. If you're a woman, don't complain to guys, and guys don't complain to women. Yeah.
I think another good example is like the whole like trading secret stuff. Like if someone prefaces something that they're gonna say like, oh, like don't tell anybody this, but like I think if it's a guy-girl relationship like that, like let's say they have a boyfriend, like a good thing to say at that point is like, oh, like I'm not sure I should know this type of deal.
Yeah, I mean that's perfectly. I mean, drawing. This is part of this too. Is just drawing healthy boundaries between yourself and other people. I mean, ultimately, remember you have their good at heart, right? It's not like you're like just trying to extricate from a really awkward situation. You have their good at heart, right? Because it's not good for them either.
Yeah, because like in that example, the teen may or may not be related to like that's not healthy for like her relationship and the boy.
Not at all. Not at all. Because either way, it's going to come to a head, right? It's going to come to a certain point where, if I'm not sort of honest about it initially, that it's just that emotional attachment is just going to keep growing, and then I'm going to have to really awkwardly get out of it, or continue to just go along the same way.
So, the greatest love is to give your life for your friends. How does that, you only truly give your actual life to one person, whether it's church, wife,
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? How do you give your life for your friends in that sense?
Well, there's. I mean, I think it's easier to see if we don't take a really hard case like that. There's only certain things that I can do for my friends because I'm married, like guy friends, even just guy. There are certain things certain parts of friendship that are closed off because I've already given that part of me to my wife. And it's the same thing when you then go to work friends that are of the opposite sex. What you're really asking me for right now, I've already given away. An emotional ear at that level isn't mine to give any longer. I don't own it. And again, I wouldn't say that out loud, but that's the point, right? So it's. I mean, a lot of life is just drawing healthy boundaries with people, right? Just learning how to do that without being cold.
And that's still taking control and command of your free choice of your will.
Yeah.
You're deciding where those boundaries are. If you're if you don't have those boundaries drawn, then you're just exactly like what you said earlier, back into the wind. It's you're not gonna. It's gonna be very disorderly.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, you can't going back to the example, you can't be that for them, right? No matter how bad you feel for them, or I can't give you that. I can't be that for you, and that's okay. That's not an act. That's an act of love, because what you're telling them is you need someone to count on. I ain't it, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We're limited creatures. That's okay. It doesn't mean you don't wish them well. You're actually wishing them well by telling them, don't count on me for this. But I mean, the other flip side of it is that just as guys recognizing that sometimes that you're like, because there's been plenty of times in my life where I haven't actually realized that, like, because I didn't think about it long enough to go, wait a second, and I have had an awkward extrication. So just knowing that as a guy, going, wait a second, like she's depending much more on emotional, because you think, well, it's perfectly fine. I mean, I'm not physical with her, it's fine, but that's not the way she would look at it, right? I really depend on that person emotionally.
And it's like, and that goes like both ways though, because like you're protecting like yourself to become an object of abuse, but you also, you know, as a guy, like you're protecting them from being an object of abuse, because like, you know, if that happens enough, then, you know, thoughts could pop in. It's like, wait, like if they like break up, like, you know, like
Yeah.
I think another really big thing with emotional chastity is DTRs. So like
defining the relationship.
define the relationship conversations. Like,
You guys have an acronym for everything. Okay, just told me what that was because I was just going to say, shake my head, probably should know what that is.
If there's a potentially awkward guy in a relationship that should not be awkward, like a lot of that is just going to be ambiguity. So like it's hard to do a DTR, but like you said, like, or like you can do it like casual comments, like, oh, like I'm really glad we're friends or something like that. Like, or you can go a little more awkward. And, like, hey, by the way, like I'm really stay with friends. Like I'm not interested in doing something more than that. Like that kills a whole lot of the ambiguity. It kills the ambiguity. Like it like means the girl in most cases like is not going to be like fantasizing and like diving super deep into like, oh, like he said this and he pulled the chair up that one time, like all this other stuff's like gender ambiguity is very important.
Yeah. Well, and it keeps like I said at the beginning about the idealizing of you, right? Like, well, that's we're just friends. That's fine, but you're really fulfilling her sentimental need, right?
And it's also mature.
There's that too. Are there other questions or comments? So hopefully this was practical enough, like that you go, okay, I begin to understand how I'm wired, how people of the opposite sex are wired,